So next, I'm excited to introduce Isaac Orr. Isaac serves as Vice President of Research at Always On Research. His previous position was Energy Policy Fellow, Energy and Environmental Policy at the Center for American Experiment. In his new role, he writes about energy and the environmental issues, including electricity policy and mining. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the New York Post, and many other publications. He grew up on a dairy farm in rural Wisconsin, which is why he's so passionate about standing up for rural America and the rural electric cooperatives. Please welcome to the stage Isaac Orr.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody, thanks for having me. I'm going to be talking about the EPA regulations that Brent kind of hinted at earlier and their implications for grid reliability moving forward. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I don't have anything to add for my dairy farm upbringing, but Waupaca, Wisconsin is where I grew up. So the reason that I think that it's so important, or one of my main gripe, and my friends, the city slickers, get sick of hearing it, is too many people think milk comes from the store, and they also think that electricity comes from the outlet. And when you have that mindset, you take it for granted. So that's where we're at as a society. Too many people just think, we can continue to impose regulations or make things more difficult for our food producers, for our power producers, and they're still going to get that same quality at the same price or even a lower price. And as all of you in this room understand, that isn't how this is going to work. So I was a big fan of tractors as a kid, as you can tell. This one was a green tractor, mostly because I had to power it myself. This is one reason why I was very excited to give a talk for Dairyland Power, because of the tractor reactor. So I was reading up on the history of nuclear power in Wisconsin, and I came across the boiling water plant here that was owned by Dairyland, and I saw somewhere they called it a tractor reactor because it was built by Alice Chalmers, which isn't the kind of tractor we had at the farm that I grew up on. We had Ford tractors, and Ford hadn't built a tractor since the 60s. But my grandfather on my mom's side there's still Alice Chalmers at that home farmstead in the garage. So I think that's just really cool. So I think it's also very exciting that Dairyland is leading the charge in looking at new options for nuclear power. They're looking at multiple reactor designs at different sites throughout their footprint. So hopefully you guys can get that done, because I do think nuclear power is the future. But if you build a new nuclear power plant, I want you to paint an orange tractor on the side of it, or paint the whole thing orange, just a blaze orange monument to grid reliability. Then you can get Charlie Behrens to come and give the meeting next year. If I got sandwiched between Miss America and Charlie Behrens, I'd be pretty happy with that. So I'll be like, I gave the worst talk out of all three of them, but how do you compete with that? So. All right, so about Always On Energy Research, it's a new firm that my coworker Mitch Rolling and I started. So we are dedicated to modeling the reliability and cost implications of federal and state regulations, because we want to promote reliable energy, affordable energy, and if you can reduce your emissions afterward, awesome, let's do it. But this is in order of operations. It's reliability first, affordability second. Our clients include state agencies, private companies, and public policy organizations throughout the country. And our final carbon rule modeling was commissioned by the state of North Dakota. We worked with the North Dakota Transmission Authority, and it was actually used in the stay motion filed by 27 states to basically stop the rule from going into implementation. So we've worked our way into being included in some pretty influential work there. And we've got experience modeling the impact of regulations in the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, so MISO, that's the one we're enjoying right now, and also Southwest Power Pool. All right, so Biden administration's finalized EPA regulations. So this is an article that Mitch and I wrote last year when the proposed rules came out. So it's on our Substack, Energy Bad Boys, if you want to check that out. But the EPA has finalized a slew of new regulations that are basically adding more straws to the camel's back and hoping that eventually whatever rule a certain plant has trouble complying with will force it to shut down. So you've got the ozone transport rule, the coal combustion and residual rule, mercury and air toxic standards, and then the carbon dioxide regulations on existing coal and new natural gas-fired power plants. And this is all happening at the same time when the federal government is doing a lot, basically everything they can to increase the demand for electricity through tailpipe regulations, electrification efforts. So we are basically burning the reliability candle at both ends by closing reliable plants or limiting their ability to participate in the market while also increasing the demand for power. State of the grid, I won't belabor this too much because I think Brent did a really good job of laying this out, but we are in a reliability hole and we need to stop digging. So NERC's long-term reliability assessment put MISO as the region most at risk of rolling blackouts in the 2024 to 2028 timeframe. And that's because too many thermal plants, most of them coal, are going to be retiring, and the resources that are set to replace them are intermittent, so wind and solar, and they don't have the same capacity value. We're going to talk a lot about capacity value later. I know it's a riveting topic for conversation, but we're going to make it fun, so don't worry. Many of the areas not highlighted on this map are also in trouble. PJM has sent out warnings about their future grid reliability, but they're talking 28 and 30. And then the Southeast region, so North Carolina, South Carolina, they had blackouts during Winter Storm Elliott because of natural gas delivery problems. So the whole country is either at higher risk for blackouts or has had them recently, and the EPA regulations are going to make this worse. So just quickly note, MISO thinks that we could be looking at a capacity shortfall as soon as plan year 25-26, so next year. And the only reason we're not in this situation right now is because delayed coal plant retirements. So if those delays are no longer delayed and these plants shut down, like we're looking at in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and others like that, we're going to be looking at a potential 9.5 gigawatt capacity shortfall by planning year 28-29, which the entire state of Wisconsin has a peak power demand of about 13 gigawatts. So think most of the state is blacked out if we have a situation like that. And it's also refreshing that NERC has identified energy policy as a threat to grid reliability. And I think that it was too little too late from my perspective, but I'm happy that they're on board and we're talking about this because policy is the #1 driver of the transition of the generation fleet. All right, so our rules. We looked at MISO and Southwest Power Pool for EPA's final CO2 regulations. The big things that you need to know for this regulation, EPA said if you want to run your coal plant past 2030, you need to install carbon capture and sequestration. I think that's right. You need to install carbon capture and sequestration equipment on that plant by 2032. Strike that. If you want to run it past 2040, you need to put CCS on it. Otherwise, you need to shut it down by 2030. So essentially, it's putting a retrofit or retire question in front of the coal plant owners. And there's a handful of coal plants in the United States that are looking at carbon capture and sequestration. A handful of them, or a couple of them are in North Dakota. But capturing 90% of the CO2 and piping it somewhere else to go underground isn't going to be feasible along that timeline, just because how are you going to get the CO2 pipelines permitted? We've already seen huge problems with that in Iowa, North Dakota, and Illinois. And the new natural gas plants basically say they're going to also need CCS, or they're going to have to operate below certain capacity factor thresholds. So if you want to run a combined cycle natural gas plant, if you want to avoid the CO2 regulations from EPA, it needs to run at 39.9% for your new natural gas plant. So NTEC, that's a combined cycle plant, right? NTEC would have to operate below 40% of its potential output in order to not be subject to these rules. So, I mean, I'm sure that the modeling is not looking at that, but we'll see. what the finances for a lot of these plants look like. Operators like yourselves are going to have very hard financial decisions to make moving forward. So EPA, when they make a regulation, they don't measure the reliability impacts of the regulation. They look at resource adequacy. And I like to talk about resource adequacy like pole vaulting. You're essentially looking to see if you have enough reliable resources on your grid in order to clear your bar, right? So let's look at a bar. This is a hypothetical resource adequacy situation. So this is a smart system operator because they have enough dispatchable plants to meet their projected peak demand plus their target reserve margin. You know, the resource adequacy graph is basically playing with Legos until you meet your target margin. You're stacking your coal, your natural gas, your nuclear, your hydro, and then hopefully if you've got wind and solar, you're not counting on those to show up when you need the power the most because they may or may not be there. So this is a smart grid operator in my opinion. So this is not what EPA did. So EPA is assuming that 99% of the changes in the resource fleet moving forward are going to be due to the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies and not the regulations that they are promulgating. However, they did not look at resource adequacy or reliability of the 99% change that they've done. So they had a baseline, they called it the post-IRA base case. They didn't investigate whether that was going to be adequate or reliable. The only thing that they did in their regulatory impact analysis, that's just a really long document that says this regulation makes sense and we think it's going to pencil out. So that RIA is, too many acronyms, but is going to only look at the 1% difference between that base case and the proposed regulation, which I think is a lot like looking or doing a studying the structural integrity of the top floor of a 100-story building without doing the same thing for the preceding 99 floors. And basically, it looks great on top, but you hope the rest of it works out. Spoiler alert, it is not going to work out. So when we look through EPA's regulatory impact analysis, they've got a whole bunch of Excel files that say, this is what we think the grid is going to look like moving forward. So in MISO, they think that the coal fleet is basically going to shut down by 2035, and they think that almost all of the new capacity that's going to be coming online is going to be wind, solar, or storage. So the black line up here shows the projected peak demand that EPA thinks we'll have moving forward, and this is how they're going to meet that. So as you can see in this graph, you need wind, solar, and battery storage in order to meet the projected peak demand after 2030. So from 2035 to 2055, we are depending on intermittent resources performing in order to reliably serve your customers. And EPA did their capacity accreditation or their capacity stack, and they're giving each of these resources a value or a reliability value. It's a percentage. So EPA thinks new and existing thermal plants will be available 100% of the time, which we all know is not the case. You can have refueling outages for a nuclear plant or maintenance outages for coal, natural gas. You can have pipeline disruptions. So this is much higher than what MISO is. MISO is currently giving these plants like a 90%, and they're actually downwardly revising those moving forward. But I want you to look in the final rule column for new solar and new wind. So you're looking at 8 to 23 for wind, which isn't as bad as the new solar, which is saying 30 to 52% capacity values moving forward into the future. So that's saying that when we have our peak demand, we think we can bank on solar anywhere between 30 to 52% of that power demand, or of their installed capacity, their nameplate. So this is what that graph looks like. We saw that big graph with all the wind and solar. This is what it looks like when you apply EPA's capacity accreditation metrics to it. So again, we see that in order to meet your peak demand, you need wind, solar, and battery storage to be there from 2035 onward, and the gap gets worse in 2040, and then EPA builds a little bit more natural gas in order to firm up the system in the later years of the model run. But this is all EPA does for grid reliability. They say, well, we've done our resource adequacy analysis and we think it looks good. And we're just going to compare that to what MISO thinks moving forward. So MISO is adopting a new formulation called the direct loss of load formula. We don't need to get into it. But what they think is happening is as you have more wind and solar on the grid, it's generally all on or all off at the same time. So if you have a situation where you've got a wind drought like we had in 2020, where we had 80 straight hours of wind operating at below 10% of its potential output, and for 42 straight hours below 1.5% of its potential output, you effectively have to pencil that in for a very low capacity value. So MISO believes that after 2030, they're going to give solar a 4% or 4.5% capacity value, and that's averaging the summer and the fall, winter. They're doing like a seasonal accreditation, so these are averages. But MISO is also saying, okay, we think 12%, 11% for wind, and those are higher than what EPA is estimating in their rules. And this is going to become very important because if you run EPA's big capacity stack that we showed the first graph, and you apply MISO's accreditation to it, we are not hitting our projected peak demand. So this is a big no-no when you're doing a resource adequacy analysis. No-no is a technical term. And then you can have, if you have these unreasonably high capacity values, you're going to have periods where you're underperforming them. So this is based on MISO's 18.1% capacity value for solar or wind that they had last year. But when we had our peak demand last summer, wind was operating at 5.9%. So roughly a third of what MISO thought was going to be available at that time. And these are all MISO-wide data that we get from the US Energy Information Administration. So we look at the reliability of this grid. So what we do is, this is a lot of text, so don't worry about it. I'll explain it. So we take the grid that EPA envisions will be in existence in the future, and then we say, okay, what happens if we apply the hourly output of wind and solar to this grid that we've seen in 2019, 2020, 21, 22, and 23? This is a very basic hindcast it's a stress test, right? So every hour, you can figure out the capacity factor of wind and solar. I just showed you a graph. So all we did is we took these historical comparison years, is what we call them, and we just run them through EPA's modeled MISO grid, and we say, can this keep the lights on? That's all we're doing. It isn't rocket science, but EPA hasn't figured out how to do this, which is good job security for us, but it would be much better for the country if they did know that. And what we see is we see big capacity shortfalls. So EPA's storage runs out in the middle of the day in July so basically this is using 2020 demand and weather. So the squiggles on the graph are for wind and solar are from the year 2020. We would see a maximum capacity shortfall that equates to about 19% of the total load on MISO, which is about 8.8 million people would experience rolling blackouts. And this is also employing a lot of the reliability mechanisms that EPA has built into the rule. So essentially what that means is we let the natural gas and oil plants charge the batteries in order to help limp us through this situation. So you've got 3 separate capacity shortfall events here. And the biggest one, almost 26,000 megawatts, which is just enormous. Like I said, 19% of the total planning reserve margin. Sorry, I misspoke there. But this is what happens to the wind during that period. So MISO saying, okay, well, we've got a 15 or 14% capacity value on the wind. During the heart of the peak of that blackout, capacity factor of wind is 4.1%. So you're playing with fire when you are depending on wind and solar in order to meet that projected peak demand. So when we look at so basically this capacity shortfall is enough to black out regions 1 and regions 5 from MISO. So that's all of North Dakota, all of Minnesota, western Wisconsin, and then the St. Louis area in MISO. So we're talking about a very large outage. So if you were concerned about MISO, SPP said, "Hold my beer." This is even more alarming, and I won't belabor the points here, but so here we see that we are not even close to meeting projected peak demand with coal, natural gas, oil, hydro, nuclear, anything that you can turn on, right? So we are heavily dependent on wind and solar from every year beyond 2030 in the SPP. In the SPP modeled grid that EPA put together. These are EPA's own figures. We're just stress testing it. And here's the very, very, very concerning part. Look at the capacity accreditations that EPA is giving to solar. So new solar, 83 to a 100% capacity accreditation. And then the existing solar is 82. It is always sunny in EPA's modeling, and it is not always sunny in the real world. So the wind accreditation, existing wind, I'm cool with that, 10%. You know, we can talk about that, but the new wind has a crazy fluctuation in the range. But when we apply that capacity, SPP thinks that this is okay. Or sorry, EPA thinks that this is an okay grid for SPP, where you are very, very dependent on wind and solar showing up to the extent that they think they will in that chart that I just showed you in order to meet your peak demand, let alone your target reserve margin. And then you get this, when we do that same reliability stress test that we did before. So this is 13 capacity shortfall events within 13 days. And it's largely because EPA is using just an entirely irresponsible capacity value for solar. And the other interesting thing about this modeling, when you look through EPA's data, they think that Southwest Power Pool is going to be a net exporter to MISO in their grid of the future. So I'm not shocked very frequently. I'm cynical. I've been accused of being very cynical. This shocked me. The fact that we could have a modeled grid that is this unreliable moving forward for a regulation that is going to have such widespread impacts on the American electric grid, this was jaw-dropping. This is what the 13 capacity shortfalls look like. The big one is 27.7% of Southwest Power Pool's demand during that time. So that's roughly 5.2 million people. So conclusions, EPA doesn't know what it's doing when it comes to promulgating regulations that are going to have profound impacts on the power sector. They just don't. They are playing with fire, and they don't know what they're doing. The use of resource adequacy modeling instead of hourly reliability modeling is simply inexcusable, and it borders on gross negligence. And buy a generator. Show of hands, who's already got one? Oh, man. You're going to have to hook me up with your dealer. I need a deal. So cool. So those were the conclusions. So if you have questions, comments, or scathing rebuttal, I'm happy to hear them. You can check me. You can email me at isaac@aoenergy.org. My phone is on there. Check out our Substack, Energy Bad Boys. We have a new article up every week where we talk about our findings and just things that we think are interesting within the industry. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions and scathing rebuttal. So yeah, thank you very much. No one has any questions. All right, perfect.
What does AI contribute to your numbers going forward?
So EPA does not have a large AI base case within their own modeling. So, you know, if we were doing this analysis based on what we thought was going to be the trend moving forward, I mean, you're looking at 3 to 4% growth per year is what some of the utilities are modeling in terms of the demand for artificial intelligence. So, you know, each one of these buildings takes like 50 megawatts. And, you know, out in Minnesota, they shut down a coal plant, the Sherburne County coal plant, 2,200 megawatts, big, beautiful coal plant. And they're putting all kinds of AI data centers in there. And there's, you know, I guess they're in the planning stage right now, but each one of these buildings, they're going to be having, I think, 1,000 megawatts of demand, which is the equivalent of the Monticello nuclear plant out there. So It's going to be enormous. We're not ready for it. I do think that the demand growth in AI is going to force us to get good at building new nuclear power plants because you're going to have deep-pocketed tech companies that say, oh, I guess we can't run these data centers intermittently, so we're going to be building new nuclear, we're going to be building gas, and that's going to be how we're doing it. I also think that we should be putting a moratorium on coal closures, unless you've got like a very compelling economic reason for doing it. Am I cutting out? Okay. I'll just yell. All right, any other questions? All right, perfect. Come on up.
Well, thank you. It cut me off, too.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Here, use this. Just get real close.
Okay. I just met you.
Yeah, well, COVID's over.
Yeah. So, great presentation, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and I agree COVID is over. I've been thinking about this from maybe what options we have going forward, and we're dealing with NRECA, and they've filed a lawsuit to stop this, and we've done some declarations. Ben did a great job with that. We were one of 14 G&Ts. What are your thoughts on where the IOUs are on this? What are they thinking? Do you have any insight?
So I've been a little surprised that some of the investor-owned utilities have been pushing back against this rule. So Mitch and I we've been in the trenches fighting Xcel Energy on their integrated resource plans a lot of the time because previous to this new role, I was doing energy policy in Minnesota, and we call it green plating the grid. The investor-owned utilities have a strong financial incentive to shut down their depreciated coal assets, natural gas assets, and build a whole bunch of new stuff because they're guaranteed to make that money back plus a 7.5% return. So a lot of times they're like, oh no, don't regulate us. We'd hate to have to close down our depreciated assets that aren't making our shareholders any money and then build a whole bunch of new stuff and basically ladle out profits to the shareholders at the expense of the ratepayer. So as you can tell, I prefer co-ops to investor-owned utilities for that reason.
I kind of prefer the model where you don't have to worry about your stranded assets.
Yeah.
But all the people in this room are the ones that have to pay our stranded assets.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's a different model.
It must be nice, huh?
No.
Good work if you can get it, I guess. Yeah. So there have been a few investor-owned utilities that are pushing back, and I think that's their understanding that, okay, EPA is not being reasonable enough with this proposal. And I think the proposal was rushed because they wanted to be able to finalize the rules before it could be subject to a Congressional Review Act should President Biden not get reelected. So there were a lot of political decisions that were made in order to strip out the existing natural gas plant from the rule that was part of the original proposal, but also they knew that they had to get the rule out there before it could be subject to CRA.
Yeah, and we're planning for the rule to stand. We're hoping and fighting and working to see that the EPA maybe thinks about things more reasonably. The courts will step in. But from a planning perspective, and you saw the curvy road heading towards the horizon, this rule is one of the curves in the road in terms of what we do long term. So any other questions for Isaac? Did we spur other thoughts? Okay. Well, thank you, Isaac. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No problem.